All right, so welcome back, everybody. Thank you for chiming in. I have a few things. First of all, I feel like I'm like gaslighting people when I say, "Hey, next week I'm going to talk about something else," and then I start talking about something completely different. But it just so happens that I know I announced I was going to be talking about environmental racism and that those kinds of things. But over the week, I actually ended up lecturing about medical violence. And I thought that it would be an interesting topic to share, primarily because I am following a specific timeline, a historical timeline. And as we superimpose this, I thought it would be really interesting, specifically interesting for the people who are listening on IG Live, and then for the people who want to see the lecture. So I figured I'd just jump into this topic, and then we'll still jump into reparations, but I also remember that somebody early on had requested us covering this specific topic too. So, friendly reminder for those of you who might be listening in the IG Live session right now, you're welcome to see the slides. You're welcome to jump in and see the slides and the material and follow along. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A. You can jump into the Zoom chat with me right now by clicking the link in my bio. At the very top, it'll take you to the Zoom link. You'll be able to jump in and just kind of stick around. I would love to have you. Maybe you have questions and things like that. The other thing I wanted to announce before we got started was because I am a one-man show, I forgot to hit record last week. So we ran an entire live show. We had a phenomenal discussion around the topic that we covered last week, all kinds of questions and back and forth and things like that, and I completely forgot to hit the record button. I have made sure to do that this time, so I will not be repeating that error again. I'm sorry I didn't hit record. Last, but not least, announcement is just a friendly heads up. We will not be meeting the following Sunday. Okay, so the holiday Sunday that's coming up next week. We will not be meeting. I would like to enjoy that holiday, but we will be meeting the following Sunday. So without further ado, let's go ahead. Let's jump into this topic here, medical violence, and really just the topic of medical exploitation, specifically as it relates to African Americans. This should be fairly insightful. The first thing I want to kind of refresh your brain about to talk about here is what you see on the screen, the Holocaust. Believe it or not, I have had in the past those really oddball students, one of whom vehemently denied that this ever occurred and that this was a thing. So moving forward, I'm just operating on the assumption that we are both of the understanding, not the belief, but the understanding that this happened. Millions of people were killed and slaughtered. We're not here to debate this topic, but the reason why I'm bringing up the Holocaust to you here is for a few reasons, right? You had Jews that were being ethnically persecuted, entomized by the elected state of Germany, eventually put in concentration camps, and then hauled off into death chambers and death camps, right? Um, and so this sets a kind of cultural precedent. On the one hand, you could say, and I have made this argument before, that the United States and its actions and its persecution of African Americans and other racial minorities in the context in which they were being treated is directly correlated with what would eventually happen to Jews in Nazi Germany and proximate countries, right? But then also on the back end, after the end of World War II, you also got this kind of cultural revolution in specifically in the United States when it came to addressing the atrocities of the Holocaust and making sure that those things would never happen again. This is symbolized by something called the Nuremberg Trials. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the Nuremberg trials were basically a series of trials that were held, excuse me, at the UN, the United Nations in New York. And the idea was after World War II, you had lots of Nazi affiliated military journals, doctors, researchers who completely fled. They fled into many different countries. Some of them fled to France. Some of them fled to the UK. Some of them fled to Argentina and Brazil. Others, believe it or not, would flee to the United States. And so those researchers, the doctors who would be caught, would inevitably be put on trial. Now, what are they being put on trial for? They're being put on trial because of their engagement in human experimentation, which counts as a kind of war crime. It's a crime against humanity. Okay. And so those doctors, the picture that you see here, are in fact the very real doctors. There were 9 of them that would be put to trial for this. You can see they're wearing headphones because some of them don't speak English, and so they're listening to this hearing. Now, the very core of this trial was the fundamental aspect of human experimentation. You had Nazi doctors that would do things like strip a Jew down completely naked, put them into a brick chamber with no light, no fresh air, no nothing, just sit them in the dark and see what would happen, see how long it takes them to just die. In other cases, they might cut open, I'm just kind of making it up, but on this notion of cutting open a person's back and then sewing a pig's ear to their back to see if it will heal over or what would happen. In other cases, they might withhold medication from some people, and in withholding medication from those people, then seeing what would happen. How long does it take them to die? What are the consequences of withholding medicine in this regard? And then in other cases, they're just submitting people to euthanasia. They're euthanizing them, euthanizing gays and cripples. And so, in the context of being put on trial for human experimentation, in the context of euthanasia and the treatment withholding and things like that, they have to put forward their best argument. And in putting forward their best argument, they're saying things like, for example, well, medical experimentation on human beings, in its most basic sense, really just occurs for the good of every individual, and it takes place in every doctor's office, right? And to do nothing is itself a type of medical experimentation. So, how are we doing anything that's fundamentally different from what you're doing in your everyday medical office? Well, what's the difference? Now, I encourage you, if you're watching this lecture, if you're listening along, take like 5 seconds to think about what the actual differences are between engaging in medical experimentation in the context in which the Nazis were doing it versus perhaps engaging in medical experimentation in some alternative clinical context. Let's just assume the United States, for example, right? What are the features that you think would be distinct between these two? You might say, for example, well, they're not subjecting these people to torture, right? The people who are being subjected to torture here don't have the ability to consent. Sometimes they don't even know what's happening to them. In other cases, they're being subjected to unnecessary pain and these kinds of things, right? Now, we know that medical experimentation, to some extent, requires experiencing pain, right? But not necessarily unnecessary pain. So this was the core of the Nuremberg trials, was they are trying to cling to this defense that there is no distinction between medical experimentation that they were doing and and the medical experimentation that goes on outside of any other clinical context. There's a movie that just came out about this. I don't know about it. I can't speak to it. I haven't seen it, but coincidentally, there is a movie about this topic that just released. Well, at the core of the argument, I'll just be straightforward and I'll tell you that the people who were put on trial were found guilty of crimes against humanity. They were essentially sentenced to death. To my knowledge, they had been executed. All of them are dead. None of them are alive. But at the time, in the middle of this trial, this kind of shook the medical community. To such a degree, you'll have to forgive all of the noise outside if you can hear it. It shook the medical community in the United States to such a degree that they had to be able to like distinguish themselves from this post-Nuremberg period going forward. And so the American Medical Association comes out with a statement about what they think happened in the trial, their opinions about the trial, and perhaps how they can go about repositioning American medicine and distinguishing it from how the Nazis were trying to buddy up, approximate themselves to what happens in the context of U.S. clinical health practice. So the American Medical Association comes out and they say, well, a primary scientific criterion of usefulness in medical research is whether the observed phenomenon can be verily produced in or applied to human beings. At some point in medical research, therefore, the investigation must be performed with human beings if that research is to fulfill its primary objective. And despite these obvious considerations, and despite the demonstrated value of medical research in terms of saving life, relieving pain, and achieving other goals considered worthy, the use of human beings for experimental purposes often encounters vigorous opposition, right? And the reason for that is because there is a kind of, I don't want to say unanimous because the Nazis didn't feel this way, but outside of the Nazis, there is this unanimous regard for the delicate nature of human life and the delicate character of human life that distinguishes American clinical practice from something like the Nazis. So, in the context of this post-Nuremberg period, you have people who are they basically put together a code of ethics for any human subjects research going forward. Is that in order to clearly steer American medical doctors away from repeating the atrocities that were conducted in Nuremberg, the Nuremberg codes would inevitably be published, and this is in 1947. Now, keep this year in mind. I want you to keep the year 1947 in mind, specifically because throughout this lecture, we're going to be following a timeline of events, and so I want you to be able to properly place this year in its appropriate context, okay? But on the topic of the Nuremberg codes, right? They're saying, for example, that any patient or any participant of any research regarding any human subject of any kind, they must have voluntary consent. Well, what is voluntary consent? Is that the person who is participating in the study is intentionally agreeing to be a part of that. They voluntarily agree to be a part of that. They're not just taken off of the street and then subjected to whatever the conditions of the experiment are. Second to that is informed consent. That it's not just about voluntary consent, but that they know all aspects of the research that they are engaging in and then are volunteering on the basis of their understanding, right? Then all unnecessary pain and suffering must be avoided. And I think this should be fairly straightforward here, that if we're talking about human subjects research in an experimental context, if there is this advent of unnecessary pain and suffering, then that research is probably not justified, right? Okay. Then they say you cannot conduct experiments in which you are expecting your participant to die or where you expect for them to experience some kind of disabling injury, right? And so that should go without saying too. That should be fairly straightforward and obvious, but they essentially need to codify this. They also say that there has to be sufficient benefit to both individual and to society to justify the risk. There must be adequate animal model research and natural history of disease to support the expectations of the benefit. There has to be adequate prep of facilities to handle any adverse possibilities, however remote. Believe it or not, whatever can go wrong will likely go wrong. You need to be prepared for that. Then, experiments that are conducted can only be conducted by scientifically qualified individuals, which was not always the case in the context of the Nazis, right? Is maybe somebody enlisted into the German military and then found their way into a specific sector of that military where, without any medical experience, scientific experience, or anything, are now tasked with the responsibility of subjecting other human beings to medical experimentation and research, right? So that's happening. Then you have that the subject must be able to stop the experiment at any time. The scientist must also be prepared to stop the experiment at any time. Okay, so these are the conditions of the Nuremberg codes that would set the stage for how human subjects research would be considered scientifically valid and meritorious moving forward. Now, I want you to keep these specific conditions in mind. These are a code of ethics. And in general, in your mind, what I want you to do really briefly is just kind of think about what the overall message of these codes is? What do you think the central point is? Now, I know you can't talk in the chat right now, so I'll kind of fill in for you, but hopefully you can do the math for yourself, is that they want human dignity to be respected. They want human beings to be able to have autonomy in the context of that research. And if they feel like they're out of control, if they feel like they're being subjected to things that make them feel uncomfortable, they have the freedom and the willpower to be able to stop. And the researchers will also honor that. Okay. These are the post Nuremberg codes. Now, keep this in mind because as we go forward in this timeline of events, the sequence of events, I want you to be able to properly place this specific set of this code of ethics here. Okay. Now, before we get into the timeline of events, I briefly want to bring to your attention an example of hypocrisy here. Because an example of hypocrisy here is going to look like Dr. J. Marion Sims, for example. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of his name. Maybe you're familiar with him, maybe you aren't. But right now, J. Marion Sims is regarded as the father of modern obstetrics and gynecology. If you don't know what obstetrics and gynecology or OBGYN is, it is a doctor who has experience or expertise in female reproductive health. Okay. And so J. Marion Sims is the inventor of the C-section, for example. He's also one of the first American medical scholars to develop an anatomical understanding of the human reproductive system. Okay. And so in this statue here on the left, you can see it says, for example, he's a surgeon and philanthropist. What is a philanthropist? Okay. The founder of the Women's Hospital of the State of New York, his brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world, and blah, blah, blah. And right, we have a monument and a statue essentially celebrating this man. Well, how did he develop his expertise? How did he develop the skills, the knowledge, the research that would allow him to develop surgical methods that are still used today in clinical practice? Well, he was experimenting on his slaves. Okay. And it would often be the case that he was experimenting on his slaves and intentionally withholding anesthesia. He would never use anesthesia. Anesthesia existed during his time. And to my knowledge, this was brought up by one of my students in class in the week prior. He intentionally chose not to. So if you can imagine being a black woman, well, really any woman, it doesn't matter if you're black, but imagine being a woman in which you already do not have freedom and autonomy, and then you are brought into a room where, without being put under, without being given pain relief or anything like that, your womb is cut open, and essentially he's going through bodies after bodies after bodies, women after women. They're screaming in pain and agony. He has to have these white men hold these women down. Many of these women would die of shock. Okay. And then eventually these white men just couldn't handle the screaming and the agony anymore. So he had to get his black slaves to come and hold these black women down. Right. And so think about this. This man is considered to be the father of modern obstetrics and gynecology. So if we are able, right, I know, for example, that the Nuremberg codes did not exist during J. Marion Sims's time. I understand that entirely. But I would like to put on you this kind of thought experimental question of, do you think that a person of his competency did not have the capacity to understand some notion of what the post-Nuremberg codes were striving to achieve and regulate? Of course he did. Just because it's 18 something something doesn't necessarily mean that when you cut open another person without anesthetic and you're hearing them scream in pain and agony, that nothing inside of your body is communicating to you that there is a problem. Of course he has that understanding. So keep that in mind, is that to some extent, there is a kind of unspoken assumption. And it's unspoken, so it's not really implied, it's not explicitly stated, but there are ways that people can figure out how to work their way around the context of the Nuremberg codes. Never did the Nuremberg code say that certain kinds of people could be exploitatively selected on the basis of their race, their class, their creed, their educational status, or something like that, right? They're just saying that scientific standards must honor human dignity. Well, in the context of American culture, where we've normalized Black inferiority, white superiority, we've normalized these things. Well, intuitively, it might be the case that yes, the Nuremberg codes apply almost entirely if that person is white. But if that person is Black or a person of color, we deem them to be expendable to some degree or something like that. Maybe we are willing to suspend our morality on that basis. And if you don't believe me, I will show you exactly what that looks like in the timeline of the United States. Okay. So moving forward here, I am going to be going through year by year. Okay. Not one year after the other, but I will be going through several periods of time in the span of years. And what I want you to do, I don't need you to remember every single year and to memorize and things like that. I just want you to be able to develop a sort of comprehensive understanding of the timeline of events, okay? And the cultural context behind the timeline of events, okay? So, right now, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the topic of forced sterilizations. Okay. Now, in the United States, forced sterilizations became a thing. And here's how. In 1899, this is maybe, excuse me, this is 20 to 30 years or so after uh, 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 American slaves have been freed. You have freedmen across the United States, and you have US politicians who have developed culture norms around the idea of controlling the bodies, the autonomy, and the reproduction of other Black people. Is that a question? I see something in the chat. Um, is there a way we can save the PowerPoint? Noel, thank you for joining, first of all. Yes, you have access to the slides. If you go to my Patreon link, and you will see the topic, the post is pinned at the top of my page on this specific topic. You're welcome to download the PDF of these slides to follow along. I'm sorry because my body is blocking, so if you're not able to see the entire thing, I apologize for that. Okay, so getting back to this, okay? In 1899, you have US politicians who have always known and normalized that they can control Black people in their autonomy and in their reproduction. And so, because you have this refugee crisis that the Freedmen's Bureau is addressing and working to remedy, you have certain US politicians, specifically the conservative ones, that are saying, hey, there's this unruly Negro problem. They're breeding like uncontrolled deer, rabbits. And we need to do something about this because if you have too many Negroes breeding uncontrollably across the United States, it stands to reason that they may pose a genetic threat to whiteness, but that also we will immediately lose control over their numbers. They might be able to engage in a revolt. They might be able to rise up. You want to be able to control this population here. Okay, so by 1900, literally the year 1900, you have the emergence of a eugenics movement. Okay, for those of you who don't know what eugenics is the idea of controlling a population's genetic makeup for certain traits that you deem to be superior, or removing what you deem to be inferior genetics out of the population, in essence, on this notion that you are guiding humanity's evolutionary trajectory towards genetic superiority to some degree. Okay, so by 1900, you have Americans that are obsessed with this notion of eugenicism, that whiteness is the apex of biological humanity, and because they are the apex of humanity, we have to do what we need to do in order to protect the purity of the white race. And that means eliminating from the gene pool a number of Black people who have the ability to reproduce with other white people. Okay. So How do you do this legally? How do you do it in a way that respects the Constitution, right? Without violating constitutional law. So over the next 7 years, you have essentially Senate and House that are trying to figure out the best way to go about controlling the uncontrolled reproduction of Negroes across the United States in a way that does not violate the Constitution. And the first state to do this, to pass this law, was the state of Indiana in 1907. They passed what was called the Indiana Eugenics Law. Okay. Now, the Indiana Eugenics Law allowed for people to be forcefully sterilized against their will and without their informed consent too, if they were taken into state custody. So if a person were taken into state custody, arrested, maybe they've broken the law, violated the law, maybe you could make up a reason for why this person broke the law. But if they can be taken into state custody and they are then at the responsibility of the state, they can then be subject to sterilization. So the state of Indiana is the first state to do this. And as we jump through decades here, by 1935, majority of the continental US had adopted similar laws. This is what it looks like. Now, what you're seeing here, sorry if my head is in the way of this map. Apologies. Like I said, you can find the slides on my Patreon, and you're welcome to see them without my beautiful face there. But what you're looking at here is a map of the continental US. Okay. And within this map of the continental US, we are looking at all of those states that passed a eugenics law by January 1st, 1935. So the striped states that you see here, which is the vast majority of the states here, have adopted similar laws by 1935. The states that have black are states that by this specific period in time, their laws are pending. The only states not to have passed anything at this point are the white states that you see here, the blank states. And only one of these states, to my knowledge, has an asterisk or a star. That is the state of Nevada. Um, I don't know the reason for why the law was repealed in the state of Nevada. If anybody has a reason or an explanation for that or an answer, I'd love it if you'd be able to contribute that, perhaps in the Q&A portion. So something we might be able to come back to. Nonetheless, what you can see is that most of the US by January 1st, 1935, has some form of eugenic sterilization law. And the numbers that you are seeing below the name of the state is the number of people who have been forcefully sterilized by January 1st. Okay, so I have a bigger version of it here on my left here. The state of Kansas, for example, has 1,260 individuals by January 1st, 1935 have been sterilized. Utah only has 94. Arizona only has 11. Let's see, Michigan has 1,465. Okay, so the number that you're seeing might be representative of how long has it been since the law was passed and adopted and then enforced. The biggest state, the state that has by this period in time sterilized the most people, believe it or not, is the state of California. By January 1st, 1935, the state of California has 9,997 individuals who have been forcefully sterilized from being taken into custody. Okay. Now, within the state of Indiana, where this started, within the first year, where Black people only represent less than a quarter of the population, more than 65% of those people who were forcefully sterilized were Black women. And I always ask my students this, and they always try to they scramble to think about what the answer to this question is. But I want to pose this question to you too, is if Black women represent the majority of sterilizations within the state of Indiana, and we could reasonably assume across the United States, what race and gender group combined, race and gender, is second to Black women, do you think? I'm talking about perhaps, before I give you the answer, perhaps white men. perhaps Asian women, perhaps Native American men. Which group do you think is going to be number two to Black women in the United States? I have a chat here. Let's see. Native American women, Tanya says. Noel, Native American women. That is incorrect. Believe it or not. Thank you for chiming in the chat. That is not the case. I'll give you one more guess, and let me see. Maybe I can jump into uh, the IG chat here. Does IG chat, do you want to take a guess if Black women are the most prevalently forced sterilized group in the United States? Who is the second most? Right? Race and gender. We have here, Tanya says Black men. No. Hispanic women. No. Okay, I know it's a scramble. It's a little bit of a guessing game. You wouldn't really get it. And I understand that. So I'm not going to make you scramble and guess the answer until you get it right, because I can't respond to you. However, the second most sterilized group is white women. Yep, there you go. There's Noel. Yep, Noel, you got it right. White women. White women would come to be the second most forcefully sterilized group in the United States, right under Black women. Why is that? Okay. I want to pose this to you. We've been talking about racism. We've been talking about race politics. We're talking about eugenics. This is a eugenics movement. Why do you think white women would be forcefully sterilized? White patriarchy here. Well, that's kind of loaded. I hear what you're saying, but maybe you could unpack it a little bit. Although I don't want to make you type an entire dissertation, right? But perhaps just kind of think about it. Why would it be? Tanya says they had disabled children or mental health issues or bad genes. No, although that is genuinely sound reasoning. Um, I always make this is a dark joke, okay? So don't take the context or this joke out of context, but I'll pose the answer to you like this. You ever heard of the Kardashians? What is what's interesting about the Kardashians? What do all of these women have in common? Is that they like black men, right? Yes. So you have white women who might have a reputation for fraternizing with Negroes. Okay. You have white women who might even have the reputation just by virtue of fraternizing with black men that she's probably fucking them too. That then there becomes a biological imperative to make sure that she cannot reproduce and threaten the purity of the white race. So you start forcefully sterilizing white women too. That's how you get there. Okay. So when we get to our topic of reparations, not next week, but the following week, when we get to that topic of reparations and we're talking about this, I want you to keep this eugenic sterilization law in mind anyway. And yes, like I said, this is 1935. So think about what the United States is doing culturally to its unwanted racial minorities that then gives inspiration to the Nazis moving forward. Think about that. Okay. Let's jump forward. Now, these sterilization laws did not end in 1935. They would go on well into the 70s. The 70s, y'all. And I'm talking like 1970 something. So between 1907 and the 1970s, you have nearly 70 years of the United States engaging in what it constitutes to be legal forced sterilization. In 1961, you have here Fannie Lou Hamer, okay, who's a black woman. She has what doctors have determined to be a malignant tumor in one of her ovaries. And they've basically scheduled her for surgery so that they can take out the affected tumor and nothing else. She agrees to undergo surgery. Okay. And she undergoes the surgical procedure, but when she wakes up, the nurse is then informing her that the doctor has completely removed her uterus. And part of the reason why the doctor removed her uterus wasn't because it was affected by the cancer, but because of pressure to do so from eugenic sterilization laws and law enforcement. So I pose this question to the people with uterus or uteruses. How would you feel if you underwent an important surgical procedure to save your life, only to wake up and have the nurse tell you that the doctor decided on their own to take out your entire uterus? How would you feel? You would probably feel violated. You would probably feel enraged. I had a student that said I would want to choke that bitch nurse out. I would want to choke the shit out of her. I want to commit an act of murder. And I don't really blame my student who said that. Yeah, Sophie, I would be pissed. Oh yeah, everybody would be pissed. So now when you see these pictures of Fannie Lou Hamer here, and you'll have to forgive me because here I am and I'm blocking one of them. I'll give you a few seconds. Sorry about that. As you're seeing her face here, she would inevitably be motivated to run for office, run for Senate, motivated to take down these sterilization laws. Okay. And so there was a little bit of time where it looked like she was going to win, but ultimately she lost her election. Now, I pose this question to you because if Fannie Lou Hamer positions herself as an advocate for the civil rights movement, for women's reproductive rights, for feminism in the United States, women's suffrage, and things like that, why have most people not heard of Fannie Lou Hamer? I would go so far as to say, in the context of feminism in the United States and the pro choice movement, I would argue that Fannie Lou Hamer should be the face of that movement. Why do you think that nobody in 2025 has ever heard of this woman? Why is that? Well, take a look. Yes, Noel, racism. Thank you. It's because she's black. It's because she's a little bit larger. It's because her eyes hang a little lower, her nose is a little bit bigger, her lips are a little bit bigger, certainly bigger around the body too. And in the American cultural psyche, if you want sympathy towards women's rights and reproductive freedom and things like that, for some reason we default to this notion that you must conjure up in your mind the image of a slender white woman if you are going to empathize with whatever it is that feminism is demanding. So part of the reason why you never even heard of this person, you might not have even learned about her until I mentioned her in my reel that people were pissed off about a few days ago. You wouldn't even know who she was. Okay. All right. So now that we've established this from 1899 all the way to 1935, you have the emergence of eugenics and eugenics laws. By the time we get to 1961, you have a black woman running for office because she was forcefully sterilized against her will. Okay. Keep your understanding of the timeline of these events in mind. Let's move forward. Because now we're going to talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Okay. The Tuskegee syphilis study here. Um, First of all, what is your understanding? And I mean this rhetorically. Feel free to write in the chat what your answer is. I'm reading your responses. Um, but what is your understanding of the Tuskegee syphilis study? And I mean that rhetorically. Just kind of think to it to yourself, because a common misconception about the Tuskegee syphilis study is that black men were infected with syphilis and then prevented from getting treatment. That is not quite true. It wasn't that these black men were being infected with syphilis. They already had the syphilis, okay? They already had it. They were tricked into it. Yeah, there was a kind of trickery at play, but they weren't being infected with syphilis. Tanya says they had syphilis and were denied treatment even after a cure came out. They were monitored and allowed to degenerate. Um, yes, correct. That is what the Tuskegee syphilis study was. It was black men who had tested positive for syphilis and then were denied treatment. And in being denied treatment, um, even after a cure has been released for several decades, they are essentially just watching these men die. Now, the goal of the study, because this is from publications that come out of 1936, there are documents around this study, the purpose of the study, the justification for the purpose of this study. Okay. And they say here, this is their own words, the researchers from 1936, they say, well, the purpose of the study is to confirm the presumptive manifestations of cardiovascular disease if possible, and to corroborate the accuracy of clinical observations in general. Now, if you are trying to confirm the presumptive manifestations of something, what does that mean in simple English? We're trying to confirm the presumptive manifestations. In essence, that means that you already know what the manifestations are, and you're just confirming them, right? They want to see what would happen in real life. Correct, but they already know what will happen in real life. That's why it's presumptive. Well, we're presuming. Now, this is not enough to go on, although I assume it would be. If this is not enough to go on, well, here's their justification. Okay, their justification, they say, is that all syphilologists recognize the great importance of treatment during the first 2 years of the syphilitic process. And all are likewise of the opinion that treatment during this period should be adequate. An accurate evaluation of the treatment of syphilis is, however, made difficult by many factors. In comparing the results obtained by modern treatment with those in untreated cases, it is important that both groups be observed for a definite period. An observation period of at least 20 years or more is necessary to give a true picture of the value of therapy. So let's break that down, okay? Because there's a lot of words there, perhaps some big words. I'm not necessarily assuming you don't know what they mean, but let's kind of break this down. Okay, the first part of this, they say all syphilologists recognize the great importance of treatment during the first 2 years. Pause. So they already knew that treatment was important. That means that they already knew what the effective treatment was. Do you see the slip of admission here? And then they say, right? And all are likewise of the opinion and that treatment during this period should be adequate. So they already know how to treat it. They already know how to treat it. They already know what the effective treatment is. And then they insert this bullshit. Oh, understanding the significance of treatment is made difficult by many factors. Well, how? If you already understand the significance of it, an observation period of at least 20 years or more is necessary to give a true picture of the value of therapy. Well, but if you already know the value of therapy, why do you need to subject people to 20 years of a lack of treatment, right? And then comes the question of, well, who are you going to subject to the lack of treatment? Is it going to be white people? Absolutely not. It's going to be black people. And why is it going to be black people? Well, because they're undesirable, because they're expendable, because, as I told you, as of January 1st, 1935, most of the continental US has adopted eugenics sterilization laws. So now you have a sexually transmitted disease for which there's already known treatment, and you get the publication of a study by the Public Health Service to study untreated syphilis in the adult male Negro population. So, what I want you to do here, don't treat the eugenics study here as if it exists in pure isolation, or excuse me, forced sterilizations. Don't treat it as being existing purely in isolation from something like the Tuskegee experiment timeline. Superimpose the timeline here, that before we even get to 1935, where you have eugenics laws, you've got black people across the nation, including white women, being forcefully sterilized. And now there is a study proposing to observe untreated syphilis in black men. You're starting to see the manifestation of medical violence. Okay. Caleb asks, is this why our elders in the black community hated going to the doctors and hospital? Yes. Yes, yes, my good sir. That is absolutely why they hated going to the hospital or to the doctor, is because you don't know what they're actually doing to you, to your body. Here you have a conspiracy for the state to sterilize you. Then you have the public health service, which is engaging in a conspiracy to watch you die of a treatable, curable, sexually transmitted illness. We haven't even gotten to the other stuff just yet, but here we are. Okay, so by the time we get to 1933, the study, which started off as a short-term study, was converted to a long-term study that ends in post-mortem analysis. What is post-mortem analysis? Post-mortem, what does that mean? It means after you die. What does that sound like it's in violation of? Sound familiar? Oh, okay. You're starting to do the math. You're starting to make sense of this. Okay, so now we have a study in 1933. Autopsy, Nuremberg codes. Yes, there you go. Okay, so now we have a study in which the goal is to watch people, black men, suffer from a treatable, curable illness and to watch them die. And by 1935, where they want more participants, they are offering a $50 burial stipend to the families of men who participate in the study, where $15 of that $50 is going to go to the person who conducts the autopsy. So really, you're getting $35. But come enroll in this study in which we anticipate that you'll die, you'll get a $50 stipend. It'll be great. You're helping us with our medical research. Okay, so by 1936, they're publishing studies because that is obligated. If you're going to have federal funding, state funding, you have to produce scientific peer-reviewed manuscripts of the data you're collecting, the progress you're making. And it's showing exactly what they already knew. Many of the men are deteriorating from syphilis. Many of them have higher risks of cardiovascular disease. They're starting to develop other comorbidities. Okay. Now, by 1938, they're like, well, we have to reevaluate the study. We need to prolong it a little bit more. We need to add more patients. They add 14 new patients to this study. Okay. Now, by 1940, penicillin, scientifically speaking, is now officiated as effective treatment to syphilis and to diabetes. Okay. But because the US government is preparing to go into World War II, essentially the US government is trying to ration all of the penicillin that is being manufactured. Now, penicillin is discovered in 1928. So, well before this study even started, penicillin had already shown, there was already common knowledge among the scientific community that penicillin was effective treatment for diabetes and for syphilis. It's only by 1940 that you now have scientific officiation of that conclusion, and it's being rationed by the United States. So, well into the 30s, they already knew what effective treatment was, but they want to see the true value of it. Let's keep going. Okay. So now we get here to 1941. And the United States is engaged in a draft. This is where you have FDR. He's drafting the GI Bill. He's trying to incentivize enlistment into the armed forces. They're getting ready to go overseas, and so there are many men that are wanting to volunteer their services to go into battle, and they're being evaluated for their physical health, right? Their mental well-being, these kinds of things. Well, some of these men are testing positive for lots of things. But those who tested positive for syphilis were turned away and told to get treatment for their disease. And once they're treated, once they're cured, they can come back and then they will be just fine. And they'll be allowed to participate in the war. Well, the black men, some of the black men who would test positive here, would just be directed to this study under the guise that this study was offering them treatment, okay, and minimizing the effects of syphilis. Now, I suppose I didn't really think about this. I should have made slides on it. But these doctors are not injecting them with anything other than saline. And the doctors are trying their best to keep knowledge of effective treatment of syphilis away from these people. They're lying to them. They're telling them that the saline in this syringe, I'm holding up a pin here, the saline in this syringe, if we can refine what's inside of here just a little bit more, we'll be able to make effective treatment for syphilis. And you're helping us to do this. We're going to inject you with this, and then we're going to watch the effects, and hopefully we can develop a meaningful intervention. So black men are getting in line. And by 1944, a quarter of their study population has now died. So by the time you get to 1946-ish, 1947-ish, this is where you get the American Medical Association publishing the post-Nuremberg codes, ethical codes for guiding human subjects research. And then this study keeps going. So by 1952, now you have nearly 60% of the study population that started from the very beginning is now dead. And of those who are alive, these doctors are just now realizing that some of the men who are alive have been getting treatment elsewhere. Their bodies are deteriorating, they're suffering the consequences. They want some form of intervention. And in trying to get that intervention, maybe if they're not getting effective treatment from these doctors, they need to go to another doctor. So only 20% of the living study population has been determined to have received some adequate treatment for their syphilis. Now, by 1955, we're 9 years after the publication of the Nuremberg Codes now. This study is looking for more volunteers. 10 years later almost, right? Here's the Public Health Service that comes out and is making a public statement praising the study. And they're saying things like, well, the study, the therapy offered here minimizes the effects of untreated syphilis. And oh, this study needs to continue. And oh, it's so great. Remember, the Nuremberg codes are now legal precedent here. Okay. So by 1965, you have some people that are coming out and they're saying, hey, this study is a sham. We know it's a sham. Look, they're not doing anything. They're just injecting these people with saline. They're watching them die. Somebody needs to do something about this. No alarms are raised. No one says anything. You get no response from the Public Health Service. You don't get a response from the media. You don't get a response from anybody. So whistleblowing, what is that going to do? It's not getting to the right people. So several more years go by. By 1969, you have the CDC that is now coming in and they're saying, hey, yeah, no, this study needs to continue. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, is encouraging the continuation of a study watching human beings deteriorate from a curable disease. Okay. It's only then by 1971 that you have somebody who works in the Public Health Service that is now intentionally leaking data and material to the media. And the media is running live with the story. It's getting played on national airwaves. And that is what leads to the discontinuation of this study by 1972. So you go all the way from the 30s, all the way into the 70s, where they have been doing this to people. Meanwhile, keep in mind, you have lots of people across the United States, mainly people of color, but other people too, who are being forcefully sterilized. Look at the cultural precedent. I want you to look through the eye of culture here. Is that you have a culture in which the United States of America is in fact engaging in acts of genocide, okay, racial persecution, inspires the Nazis, gets people to go and fight the Nazis while they're doing the same things back here at home. So why were they fighting the Nazis? Well, it's because the Jews are a kind of white person. That's the only reasonable conclusion you can actually draw there. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a problem with this being done. Okay. So by 1974, because of the fallout of all of this, you get the passing of what's called the National Research Act of 1974. And essentially, this mandates that any human subjects research must undergo rigorous scrutiny by a board of qualified bioethicists, and your study can only get approved if they approve it. So this is where you get that most universities have something called an IRB, or an institutional review board, and they will scrutinize any study of any kind, even if it's non-invasive, but it has anything to do with human research subjects. They will scrutinize it to a T, and if you are not approved to continue that study, then you cannot engage in it. Okay, so by the time you get to 1989, most African Americans don't want to participate in any clinical research. Even the clinical research that one could argue is critical, necessary, important for the betterment of mankind. Well, Black people aren't participating. So going back to where Caleb was saying or asking, why are our elders in the Black community hated going to the hospitals and the doctors so much? This is why. And among those people who are enrolling in these clinical trials, they're being characterized as, oh, you're non-compliant. Oh, you don't like to listen to instructions. You're too skeptical. You're too difficult. You don't play along. These kinds of things. Does that make Black people want to participate more? Probably not. Okay. So you get into this thing then where here you have Black people are just expendable to the United States. And remember, fast forward 1997, you have Bill Clinton who's issuing an apology to the survivors and the families of the dead. Okay. But Bill Clinton is doing this for political reasons. How do I know this? Because he is the president who has vowed to end welfare as we have come to know it. He's receiving criticism that his policies are anti-Black and that they're racist. He surrounds himself with Black women as he signs the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. Okay. And then, in order to additionally sidestep the criticism that his policies are anti-Black, he then issues a formal apology. Sorry, there's no trial. Nobody gets tried for crimes against humanity. Okay. And by the study's end, between 1932 and 1974, a total of 400 men have died or excuse me, over the course of time, 400 men were involved. 140 of them have died from syphilis or syphilis related complications. Only 74 participants are alive by the end. Approximately 40 of these people's wives were infected with syphilis, 19 of their children born with congenital syphilis. And like I told you, penicillin was discovered to be effective treatment for diabetes and syphilis back in the 20s. Okay? So, see it for what it is. And when you get these medical professionals like Dr. R. Kampmeyer, the Vanderbilt School of Medicine, saying, for example, well, in our free society, anti-syphilis treatment has never been forced. No one has ever forced anyone to undergo anti-syphilis treatment. No one is also, no one's ever implying that syphilis was a benign infection. He's minimizing the harm. And so recognize that after clear violations of the Nuremberg codes, clear crimes against humanity, you might call it, no one's being tried for crimes against humanity, right? No one's put on trial here. Okay, you have this newspaper. I'm going to take a few more minutes. Okay, I know we're going to go a little bit over 5. But you have this newspaper called the Atlanta Constitution, publishes an editorial in 1972, and they say, oh, you know, sometimes with the best of intentions, scientists and public officials and other people involved working for the benefit of us all, they forget that people are people. And they so totally forget on plans and programs and experiments and statistics and abstractions that people become objects, symbols on paper, figures in a mathematical formula, or impersonal subjects in a scientific study. This scientific blind spot was responsible for a moral astigmatism that saw these Black sufferers simply as subjects and not as human beings. Well, what are they doing there? They're just minimizing the harm. That's really it. Because if something like this happened to white people, which it has in the past, oh, then you're ready to go and all hands on deck to fly overseas to save these white people. But when we do it here to black people, you don't get the same humanitarian response. This isn't treated as a humanitarian crisis. The political cartoon you see here, for example, it's satirizing this phenomenon. It says, oh, this is a no treatment study by your public health service, with this doctor who's basically watching a black man in cobwebs as he withers away and dies, right? So now, at the same time that is going on, overlap the timeline of events here with what's going on with Henrietta Lacks. We're almost done, by the way. Okay. In 1951, you have doctors in Baltimore, Maryland, who have taken in this 31-year-old woman, and she has a very aggressive form of cervical cancer that just does not seem to be responding adequately to any form of treatment or intervention. Okay, the cancer becomes so aggressive that it spreads throughout her body. It's terminal. There's nothing they can do. She essentially dies 8 months later. Now, that on its own is not the problem. Okay, people experience terminal forms of cancer, but in Henrietta Lacks's case, it actually turns out that the cells that these doctors had discovered, the cancer cells, some of these doctors, they took a sample of these cancer cells, tried to look at them under a microscope, figure out what's going on. And what they found is that these cells keep replicating and they keep replicating and they keep replicating and they don't stop replicating and they haven't stopped replicating. We're all the way in the year 2025 now, where Henrietta Lacks' cells still have not stopped replicating. This woman has been long dead. Okay. And so the determination here is something that is medically unprecedented. We are looking at what we only know to be the only case in which a human being has what is described as an immortal cell line, a cell line that does not stop replicating. Now, scientists have been perplexed about the fact that these cells continue to reproduce over and over and over again with no end in sight. Okay. And so this becomes something of a keen interest among the scientific community. Okay. So in essence, this type of immortal cell would become known as HeLa cells or Henrietta Lacks cells. Okay. And so they began replicating these cells and then distributing them to other research facilities around the world without her or the family's knowledge, as well as without their consent. And they have been selling. Oh no, IG live stream stopped. Let's see. Hold on. Let's see here. What is happening? The IG live stream has stopped. I'm so sorry for this. What is happening here? Um, uh-oh. Okay, well, unfortunately, that's going to be an error that I will need to restart on the back end. I'm just going to keep lecturing for now. For those of you who are here, I apologize. In the meantime, for the IG live stream, it has an hour max. I've been running on IG Live for 2 hours. I've never heard of an hour time frame. So sorry to the IGers. I'm just going to keep going for the sake of the video, and then once we get to the Q&A portion, I'll try to get the the IG live stream back up. Genuinely sorry for that. Okay, so essentially they name them HeLa cells. And this goes on to generate billions of dollars in profits in cancer research, viral research, vaccine development research for decades. And none of this information was ever disclosed to the Lacks family until 1971. Okay. In 1971, you get Henrietta Lacks's family that is now struggling financially because they're Black, They're enduring the same hurdles and struggles that most Black Americans are enduring across the US. Okay. And you have the Lax family struggling here, and they're only just now finding out because somebody leaked it to the public, to the media, that Henrietta Lacks' cells have been used to generate billions of dollars in profits. And so then for decades, here they are fighting to get some kind of financial restitution, and this family never gets it. They never get it. Okay. And then after never getting any kind of restitution, they keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And all of these research institutes continue to sell, to continually replicate a piece of their family member's body. And so then it becomes a thing where now in 2023, it is to my knowledge that the Lax family has reached financial settlements with multiple institutions, but their settlements are all NDA protected, meaning that we're never really going to know what they actually settled on. And in my opinion, although one could make the case that publicizing any form of settlement would appear to unfairly evaluate the body of another individual, which should, in essence, be invaluable. But to my impression, an NDA might also just be a sign that whatever the family agreed to was probably a lowball offer. Because let's be real, if you're generating billions of dollars in profits here, then in generating billions of dollars in profits, I don't know, maybe this family deserves at least a cool $1 billion, right? Okay. So this is where you get to superimpose that by 1971, this is coming out. And around the 70s, you're also getting the emergence of the Tuskegee syphilis case. And then at the same time, you're also getting forced sterilizations. You have all of these things that are happening at the same time throughout the timeline of the United States. And I want to remind you what codes, ethical codes, were being violated. The ethical codes that were being violated here were all of these: voluntary and informed consent. There was no avoidance of unnecessary pain and suffering. They're engaging in studies in which they expect for people to die or for disabling injury to occur. There isn't really a justifiable benefit to both individual and society. In certain case, I would say in the context of Henrietta Lacks, the distinction, because Lax's cells would go on to contribute to the development of cure for polio, treatment for HIV, the COVID vaccine. HeLa cells have been critical in all of these ways. And so, to some extent, you might be able to argue, yes, there's sufficient benefit to both individual and society. But then outside of that, you're still getting violations of the Nuremberg codes that had been cultural and professional precedent, industrial precedent for quite some time. Okay. No subjects were able to stop the study. Scientists weren't willing to stop the experiment, even if people were screaming out and crying in pain and agony and prolonged suffering. And so keep that in mind in the context of how people are being treated in the United States. I think it would be fair to expect for other people to be put on trial and be held accountable for the ways that they have violated the human dignity, the rights, the freedom, the autonomy of anyone, regardless of their skin color, but namely these people. And so we'll leave it there. We'll leave the discussion there. I'm so sorry. I don't know. I had no direct role in whatever happened to cut off the IG Live stream. I am going to bring up a new IG Live stream right now. Um, if you'll just give me a moment, I have given you the ability to unmute yourself and to show your video if you want to chime in with a question while I get this back up and running in just a second. Um, Please feel free to chime in. I'm just going to do office hours with Dr. Doyle. You'll have to give me a moment. I'm sorry, I'm juggling because I'm a one-man show here. Okay, we're going to go to here. Put this in. Does anyone have any questions for me while we're doing this? Stop streaming. Are there any questions? Yeah, sure. Tanya, please feel free to chime in. Just making sure. Are you able to? Yeah, you're able to unmute.
Yeah,
There
the
you go.
video part is disabled by you still.
Uh-oh. Okay, hold on one second. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that.
Okay. So I have a question for you about all right. You put up a slide that said in Indiana, less than 25% of the people were Black, but over 65% of the people who were sterilized were Black women. Were they sterilizing men?
Yes. So I would like to distinguish castration from sterilization. Okay. They're not like cutting people's balls and testicles off and like maiming them. But in this case, yes, men are a part of the sterilized populace. They're just significantly less than women. Part of this notion, I guess you could call it cultural, is that whatever characteristics or traits that you deem to be biologically or genetically inferior, you attribute those as being inherited by the inferiority of the mother. Okay. So, in essence, as an extension of American notions of patriarchy, you get this thing in which if any sterilization laws or reproductive controlling laws exist, it's really just kind of controlling women's bodies. So
Oh,
men are in
okay.
the minority, even if they're Black. The two most prominent groups getting sterilized are Black and white women, but men are a minority regardless of race.
Okay, so I'm reading Caliban and the Witch right now, and in the preface of the book, it talks about Foucault, and one of the mistakes that Foucault makes is by merging the historical journey of men and women and kind of conflating. So for something like that, I would love to see I would love to for it to be apples and apples. So if they're sterilizing women, rather than saying less than 25% of the population was Black, I would love to know like what percentage of the population were Black women if it were women that were being sterilized. Because I think that, if women make up half of the population, like let's say 12% of the population is Black women, but 65% of them or 65% of sterilizations are Black women, I think that that's a little more stark than the 25 and the 65.
Sure.
So there's that. And then also I'm glad you brought up Fannie Lou Hamer because when you talked about her run for the Senate, it reminded me of myself and how recent events have caused me to pivot and change the direction that I was going in. So I'm a master's student right now in psychology, right? And so I've decided that I'm going to get my PhD I was thinking about getting my PhD in African American Studies. And I wanted to kind of get some advice from you about how you became a university professor. What track did you go on to become a professor? Like, what did you get your PhD in?
Yeah, sure. So to your first point, the first point is if you want to know the demographic breakdown of the state of Indiana by race, age, those kinds of things, you can probably get some census records. That's probably publicly available. It's probably in some archives in census.gov, but I know that that data does likely exist. So you might be able to find the specific allocation of Black women. Now, who among that population within those census records were the ones who had been sterilized? That might be a little bit more difficult to track down. However, if you wanted just a general picture
Yeah.
of that, you could probably get that demographic data through the census records. To your second point, around my academic track. Okay, so um, basically, I was a biology major pre-med at Loyola Marymount University, where I'm currently a professor. And I became an African American Studies minor. I was not originally interested. Well, I was always interested in African American studies, but I had no formal declaration in that field. I was just trying to fulfill a history requirement, and all of the required classes were filled up. I got the dean to sign an exemption for me to take African American histories to fulfill that requirement for my undergrad. And then that led to my journey to declaring African American studies as a minor. I was already doing wet lab research as a bio major, and so decided I wanted to find a way to merge wet lab research, African American studies, those kinds of things. I ended up applying to the University of Washington and got into the master's PhD concurrent program in anthropology, is the study of human beings. They had a wet laboratory research there where I was interested in biomarkers of chronic disease and reproduction and these kinds of things, and identifying race pattern disparities as in relation to markers of health and things like that. Eventually, I would get my PhD and complete my PhD, do a postdoc at SUNY Binghamton in medical anthropology, teaching race, health science, these kinds of things. So I was already doing a postdoctorate in an academic context. And then I became a tenure track professor at St. John's University in Queens, New York, in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Um, but the New York, I think, for the amount of money that a junior faculty makes, you don't really begin to get big money until you're like a senior professor. Um, but the cost of living in New York mixed with COVID, mixed with the fact that my wife and I, we were having our child, made it that we just didn't want to live in New York anymore. And I had essentially run myself into an academic dead end. That is that biomarkers and health disparities research for Black people is like focusing on a symptom of the problem, but not really drawing attention to its causes. And so one of the things I've always wanted to do is to make an impactful contribution to American society as a whole. I'd rather much focus my skills on the causes of inequality rather than the consequences of inequality. So I left St. John's University. I was jobless for a little bit, struggling, looked for work, eventually ended up on film and TV sets and things like that, but then got hired at Loyola Marymount University because of professional connections. And I'm now a professor in the Department of African American Studies because my field of expertise was African American anthropology. So I am an anthropologist first, African American Studies professor second, but I'm in the Department of African American Studies, so go figure. Does that answer your question?
It does. I wonder if you have advice for someone who wants to become, if you have advice for me in becoming a university professor. My main goal is to open up a Saturday school for children because one of the things that I learned this semester, so I'm taking Intro to African American Studies this semester, as well as Women and Gender Studies. And one of the most profound things that I realized from taking these two courses is that it's really not about Black people or about women. It's about overlapping systems of oppression that scapegoats womanhood and Blackness as the recipients, as the outward recipients of the oppression, but that all of us, every single person who is engaged in our patriarchal, our capitalistic societies are in some way giving way and giving into the oppression. So I want to be able to help bring this information to people as young as possible. What advice can you give me?
I'm not sure I have any advice other than create some content, start putting it out there, build an audience. That's really what I just started doing. Um, it just becomes a thing where you want to kind of centrally house all of your efforts and your goals, the goals you want to achieve, and just start sharing it with the world. That's really all I kind of have. It's not a
Okay.
great answer, but
Okay. Do you have a reading list for us?
for this topic for this week or just in general?
Just in general, next semester, I'm going to be spending most of my time just reading, getting ready for a PhD program. I'm thinking that I'm going to go the history route with a concentration in AAS, WGS. That's what I'm
Okay.
thinking.
Okay. Um, I would have to think about that. So that would probably be a conversation we would have outside of this context. Um, which if you want to schedule a call with me or something like that, I'm happy to set up. But
Yeah,
maybe
I
yeah,
sent you a message on IG
you
asking
did.
for office hours, man. I asking you
Ah,
these questions and laying everything out. And then I came last week
yeah.
having sent the message and you said these were your office hours.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm like,
These are
okay.
technically they are, but I mean, in terms of reading suggestions, I that's something I genuinely I would have to think about. I haven't seen your most recent message, so I will definitely catch up on that. I get hundreds of messages a week, so you've got to give me grace there. Oxy has been raising their hand, and I would like to give them an opportunity to chime in. Oxy,
Hello, can you hear me?
yes,
Yeah, by the way, English is not my first language, so I'm going to try
that's
my
okay.
best.
Okay.
And my phone is at 2%, but I think it
Uh-oh.
will survive.
Okay.
Um, so basically, kind of just for myself, but like learning about Black history and like I am Black, by the way. But so I was listening to what you said, and you say, for example, the CDC, like how would you say those official organization in a way? Basically approve all those kind of stuff. And I wanted to know kind of how, like, because after this, when something, a scandal like this happen, there is like they kind of make new rules so it doesn't repeat the story and everything. But the more that we learn about medical apartheid and how much, like, for example, when women give birth, their life are um, at risk. So how to this day, how come we are there? For sure, the answer is racism, but I think I want more specific and maybe specific about organization. And yeah, like how come we are still here or even not worse, but kind of in the same way and they still, and the other thing is um you told that even the media, not the media, but the doctors, like a lot of people knew kind of what's going on, but it was not important enough that we take it till it was in the media. And so is it the same today? So it's kind of a two-in-one question in a way.
Yeah, I would say that basic, the easy answer is that it's a symptom of culture. That
Mm,
the people who make up the institutional bodies, the governing bodies, they don't exist outside of American culture. They're a part of American culture. They're just the executives of all of the laws, the bureaucracy, the procedures, the things that govern people's lives. And so in America, where you have anti-blackness as a
mm,
culture norm and a cultural sentiment, you will then have people who are head of the CDC, for example, who don't think there is any risk of emergency or threat of danger or any violations of human dignity if Black people are being subject to something that would certainly be treated as such if it was done to white people, right?
mm. And but I understand, but for me it's like there's papers, there's like so basically it's kind of a story repeating itself. And we didn't really, because I'm like we know, like, for example, like, because I'm always learning, but medical racism and all is so there, so in our face. But I guess it's somewhere it's a mix between the population that we accept that because uh, there's inherently racism and anti-blackness. But so it's basically in a way it's as a group as a whole we kind of accepted and not enough to make a change.
Yeah. What I can say to that is I heard this from a faculty member in my department is history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right?
Mm,
So it is similar. The things that you're seeing are very much similar to the things that we've seen before, but they're also slightly different too. Um, but in general, I guess to an extent you could say history can in fact be kind of repeating itself now, that nothing is new under the sun. Does that make sense?
yeah, and maybe my last question, kind of two question, but and how like for example, uh, I'm trying to say in English, but basically individualists
Yeah.
and because we are functional illiteracy,
Mhm.
something like that, functional illiteracy, something like that. Basically, we can basically function, but we cannot read like big text or have you heard that word?
Yes.
Functional illiteracy. How much do you put them in what we are living today? Or
Um,
the role, kind of.
you mean like the functionally illiterate people who don't see the nuance? And like, I don't understand your question.
Be-
I'm sorry.
Because my question is like, for example, because like in my that's how I see it, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but if we don't really read text, if we don't, we know we function more by video, by audio. If we don't, so we can see stuff, but we since we don't read a lot, it's kind of added to the factor about
Oh,
what we
yeah.
live in.
Yes. Yes. These things are made worse by the fact that there is a largely uneducated populace that has difficulty seeing nuance or being able to understand how systems of oppression operate. Correct.
Okay, so is it new? Basically, it play a role in nuance and to be able to see.
Yes, critical thinking is essential to understanding complex aspects of society. And in a world where people do not read, or they mainly consume the information that is given to them in the form of a reel or political news or something like that, it means that their ability to critically think and reason is impaired. Yes.
Okay, and individualist in a way.
Yeah, individualism is a part of it. Yeah.
In kind of the same. Okay, okay. The reason why I ask it, maybe I'm wrong too, but like I feel like maybe before we were less, or we had a vision less individualist, but today is really something that we see that in most communities, I guess.
Yes.
And so I'm like, is it different maybe?
Watching lectures is making me less smart. Gosh darn it. Yeah, no, Chris, not in that regard. But you do have lots of people, for example, who post reels that are just pure misinformation or are trying to incite violence of some kind or something like that. Certainly not my kinds of reels, but a lot of these people are getting thousands of views, thousands of likes, these kinds of things. And so if that becomes the basis, I know you're teasing, but just to be clear, if that becomes the basis of common discussion around important topics, it makes it difficult
Mm.
to to come to consensus about a lot of things. Yes.
Okay.
Um, I have a comment here from Jericho Weeby97. I'm not even sure.
By the way,
Uh,
thank you.
yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for being here. Jericho says, "Idiot doesn't even know what fascism is," and this is a comment I'm assuming in connection to a post that I made that upsets. It tends to upset a lot of white supremacists around the topic of fascism. Allow me to demonstrate to you. So Charlie Kirk had posted before he passed away saying that any Democrat mayors who obstruct ICE from doing their jobs should be arrested. And so I called this a form of fascism. And so the common rhetorical talking point from conservatives, but then also white supremacists, is this notion that if you are obstructing people from enforcing the law, that's not fascism. Yeah, I mean, technically, okay, sure. Except there was no evidence that anyone was obstructing ICE from doing their job. So it really just becomes a call to arrest your political opponents with no real justifiable reason or even, let's say, perhaps due process. You just want to arrest them. And essentially, that is a flirt with fascism. I would also just like to point out that this person, Charlie Kirk, was not the only one calling for the arrest of his political opponents, but also recently, Donald Trump has been calling for the arrest of his political opponents. And not only that, calling for their execution. And so That's a form of fascism. That is flirting with fascism. It's fascism proximate. It's also just fascism in general. And so if you lack the ability to be able to connect those dots, then it falls perfectly in line with what I was just talking to this person named Oxy here. What we have been talking about here is that there are people who lack even a basic level of critical thinking and reasoning that prevents them from being able to see the nuance in lots of perspectives that makes it difficult to come to consensus or agreement about a lot of things. And unfortunately, it's not just a matter of disagreeing, it's a matter of misinformation. And is that if you don't know what fascism is and how this perfectly fits into it, the problem isn't me, it's you, buddy. Um, but we'll pivot. Anyway, would anyone else like to jump in? If no one else has any questions, then I'd like to give it back to Tanya because Tanya wants to take advantage of office hours here. So feel free, take it away. I'm here.
Yes, how wonderful. You know, I feel a little tired right now. It's tired on the
Okay.
East Coast
Okay.
because I do want to ask you some questions about your Fannie Lou Hamer post, but I'm not
Yeah,
going to get
sure.
into that right
No, no,
now.
no, no. Come on, come on. That's what this is for.
I'm fatigued right now.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just flirt
Ask it.
with it.
Yeah.
I'm curious, right?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I thought that your argument was disingenuous. The one that you
Okay.
came up with towards Just Hilarious. I thought that it was a straw man diversion. I thought that what you said really had nothing to do with what Just Hilarious was saying. And I'm a woman in gender studies person, right? And I feel that we have a blind spot when it comes to the binary. So now we know that people are saying that there's a difference between sex and gender. Yes, right? But do we not play into the binary when we only give people two options, male or female? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question is, why not come up with new words?
Hmm.
Because in the English language, right, the sex, the male, female, what creates the male or female sex is the one with the larger, fewer sex cells, and the males are the ones with the smaller, more abundant sex cells, right?
Mhm.
Why not come up with new words for people who are categorizing themselves in gender? Because if we're calling people man and woman, right? That refers to sex and gender. But if we have people who are saying that they are trans, falling into the binary, they're doing themselves a disservice. They are participating in their own erasure and in the patriarchal binary that they're trying to get out of to begin with.
Hmm. Um, okay, so I want to preface by saying I am not a gender and women's studies expert. I am an anthropologist and I have the competency to answer this question.
Okay.
However, it is not my expertise. So I am willing to admit where I may be wrong, may be ill-informed, but I will give you what is my particular opinion on this topic. Okay. Um, I think that the invention of new words is not as easy as coming up with, well, I identify as a dinglebop, right? What is a dinglebop? And I'm making that up, right? You said new word, so I'm just coming up with a random nonsensical concept, right? Is okay, I identify as a dinglebop. Well, what is a dinglebop? Okay, well, a dinglebop is this. And then that has to become culturally normative. That has to be able to be universally recognized by other people, right? Which is a kind of an uphill battle, if you will, is by the invention of new gender categories. It's going to be much harder to get something like that to be recognized and honored and respected than it would be to just identify with the concepts that already exist. Now, having said that, okay, if you are able to distinguish sex from gender, where sex is biology and gender is social, a social construct, gender is based on your performance, right? How you act, how you behave, partly based on how you present yourself to the public, what is available to you within the context of human society. generally people find appeal in what's already here in human society. The role of a woman being whatever they deem to be a role of a woman, the role of a man being whatever they deem to be a role of a man, and finding that they better fit into those classifications than they would an invented concept, right? And so for me, I am of the personal belief that a human being can identify however it is socially or culturally relevant to do so. And yes, historically, gender has been conflated with sex. However, we have millions of scientific peer-reviewed manuscripts on the concept of gender from an anthropological, a global standpoint, recognizing that even outside of Western culture, going back thousands of years, you have people who were born with a specific set of parts, and the people who were born with those specific set of parts do not conventionally identify with how Western society expects them to. And so, on that basis, then, where you have the Katuis of Thailand, you have the Hijras of India, for example, you have notions of being two spirit in the American indigenous context. Um, that even the name two spirit is recognizing a binary and the people who exist in that arbitrary in between, that it's okay for people to identify as a woman but be born male, it's okay for people to identify as a man and be born a woman, and that scientifically moving forward we really just need to treat these things as two distinct factors and just leave it there. And yes, while there is a binary, there are still fluid in betweens on the biological front and on the sociological front. And I don't know if my answer was too convoluted. Based on the receptiveness of some of my audience members, I am of the assumption that they're able to follow, but I would like to give it back to you so I'm not monologuing. Are you following what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying. I feel that for for the long haul, that we have to start getting people to become comfortable with the fact that there are more genders out there, that there's more than just the gender binary. And I feel that in order to long term, like not just thinking about right now and what already exists, right? Because a person who was born male, who I think they AMAB, assigned male at birth, they're saying, or AFAB, assigned female at birth, right? The people who have gone through that journey, I feel that the journey needs to be respected and honored, and trust what it is that I'm learning in my women and gender studies class. Just like you mentioned, all of these people who have, different gender expressions, etc., the travestis, the two-spirit, these people were not acknowledged as the other sex. They were acknowledged as a different category. And because of patriarchy, we were pushed back into the gender binary. But I feel like people have to take their visibility now to advocate for new gender expressions. Just like the flag, like the rainbow flag has all of these different beautiful colors, etc., on there that people were not even thinking about decades ago or centuries ago. And I feel like now that we're in the space that we are in now uniquely, I feel like now is the time that people begin to advocate. I think part of the reason that there's so much pushback is because we have people who have a unique journey saying, I am this thing. And so, like, we have people who are going through a unique journey who were AMAB, who are now saying, oh, I'm a woman and I want to be acknowledged as such. Well, two different things that are I feel the matter with this is that you are playing back into the same patriarchal binary. You're not making a way for the future. You're disregarding your own unique journey, and you are saying, I am this particular class of people. And I think that that's why there's pushback, because we're not advocating for growth, for like the new. And I know it's controversial.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just to better understand your perspective. Please don't take my question as like inherently trying to invalidate what you're saying. I genuinely want to understand better.
Hmm.
Would you then be arguing for the disillusion of the gender binary. Is that what you're arguing for?
When you say dissolution, what does that mean? 'Cause I
uh,
thought
to to
dissolution was
to
when
to
when
dismantle, right?
oh,
Because if you were saying that if a person in AMAB identifies as a woman, that they are kind of subjecting themselves to the same binary system that,
yes.
right, reproducing this binary, then it almost sounds like the implication of your words is that this man woman binary shouldn't exist. And in my mind, when I think of the man woman binary, I think of like hot and cold, right? There's whatever you want to call hot, there's whatever you want to call cold, and then there's all of these degrees of difference in the middle, right? There's lukewarm, if you could call it that, but there's not really names for every single degree, temperature speaking, degree of difference between one temperature of water from hot to cold. It's more like they're just two binaries, and then everything in between is a kind of spectrum. And so when I hear you say that people are like buying into this false notion of a binary, it almost comes off as to imply that what you are arguing is that the concept of man and woman should not exist. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is, and so no, you're right, and you make a really good point, so I appreciate that. What I'm saying is that when it comes to gender, if there are other genders out there that people are saying they represent with their journey, that those that no, there shouldn't be a binary as it comes to gender. As it comes to sex, okay, if we already have a binary when it comes to sex, when it comes to gender, if people are going to say that they have a different gender, they can't then try to fit themselves into a binary that doesn't really fit. The journey is different. So if we think about how it is that we got to where it is that we are, and listen, I'm in the closet in the WGS space because this is not a popular opinion because the popular opinion that people have adopted in the WGS space is if a person says that they're a certain gender, then they're that gender, period, point blank. But from what it is that I am learning, right? Part of the reason that, and part of the way that women became oppressed in the first place is because of the reproductive value that women have in producing new wage workers, new citizens of society. If you think about it, women have been trafficked for thousands of years because of their reproductive power, because of the womb, right? And I understand you say Fannie Lou Hamer lost her womb against her consent, but there was still something about her biological composition that created a womb in the first place. And women have been subjugated because of this inherent value encapsulated in being a womb holder, right? And we cannot now say, so it's not like we don't have female oppression. It's not like we don't have the binary. And part of the problem with the way that our societies are set up now with the white and the black and the male and the female and the up and the down is because a lot of these binaries were created for oppressive reasons. The top, the bottom, white on top, black on bottom. We have male and all the ideas of masculinity, which have been created to dominate over women, right?
So you're calling it
And
a dichotomy.
so we have a dichotomy, and dichotomies exist all throughout nature. Yes. However, what I'm talking about is the next evolution of where it is that we are going as people. And where we are going is beyond a gender binary, and people have to honor their unique position in that hot and cold, because otherwise they become invisible. Not only that, the before as a woman, before we start allowing people who are born in this binary to now say that they identify as this on this square, we first have to alleviate the oppressive forces that has me on this square to begin with. Because what is happening, in my point of view, is that there is a lot of misogyny that is being enacted onto women to force women to accept something that people are saying they are experiencing, which is not scientifically provable.
What do you mean when you say they're experiencing something that's not scientifically provable? What do you
Is
mean
there
by that?
something that can scientifically, because from what it is that I've seen, brain scan studies have been debunked. If you know something that I don't know, what it is that I know as of today, and I'm
By who?
open to new information,
Yeah,
that
sure.
there's no such thing as a trans brain. That's what I have heard, that the trans brain study was debunked. Is
Oh,
this not true?
you're talking about dimorphic sizes of regions of the brain uh corresponding to how people identify within their gender.
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. Well, I can't speak to this notion that they've been debunked. But it to me, what it sounds like is you're in the in between. And what I mean when I say that is there are some ways in which you are willing to distinguish sex from gender, and then other ways in which you are not. And it almost seems selective. And so I want to know from you, obviously, it can't be both. Either you conflate sex and gender and you're treating them as if they are synonyms, or you can treat them as independent and discrete categories. Where are you in either of these options? That's going to guide how I can respond.
I'm in the, we're in new territory, right? So I saw someone in a video talking about a female peacock. This is what they said in the video, female peacock. And we know that that is a peahen. It's a peahen, not a female peacock, right? So I'm of the belief that that a woman is an adult human female, that a man is an adult human male. That's what I believe. And
Okay.
I am not of the camp that is saying that is inextricably tied to sex, but I am of the camp that there are biological sexes.
Okay. So, all right. So now I can respond. Okay. So I would say your understanding of gender is culturally context. There is a cultural specific context for that. In the culture that you were raised in, to be a man is to be male. To be a woman is to be female, and there is no in between. There's no mix up, there's no mix and match. It's either you're this or you're that. Okay. When we go outside of the westernized context and we start looking at just other global indigenous cultures as they naturally exist, some of these cultures have no historical connection to one another. So there is a consistent phenomenon across the world in the anthropological and cultural context in which there are people that are born male and born female, but are identifying as women and identifying as men. That is before we get into the concept of patriarchy, before we get into the concept of misogyny and gender oppression and all of those things. You have human beings who have been doing that and doing it for thousands of years. So if they've been doing it for thousands of years, it's actually not new territory. Okay. Where you're feeling like it becomes new territory, and this is not, I'm not trying to browbeat you when I say this, more than I'm just trying to draw your attention to something, is that part of your beliefs are coming from the culture of the colonizer. Okay. Many of these people, the colonizers who would go and invade India, invade Australia, invade these places, are imposing their religious ideologies on these people, their social ideologies, what they deem to be normal versus what they deem to be sacrilege. Those things are then being imposed on them. And when it comes to gender politics, what ends up happening is what's imposed on them is there is only man, There is only woman. Men have penises, women have vagina. You can't have anything else. And the reality is, when you take a step philosophically and epistemologically outside of colonial philosophy and notions of colonial normalization, it's actually the case that gender and sex are discrete factors. Okay. This is why you're getting across the world, regardless of the culture, you have people who maybe their parents are raising them, and at no point are their parents saying, hey, would you like to be a woman? Would you like to be a man? It's your choice. And then they somehow end up coming to that conclusion on their own. It is a naturally occurring phenomenon. And the only reason it's new is it's new in the colonial mindset, the one in which the views of the colonizer were centered as the norm and were considered to be the operative norm, and then views all of the anomalies, all of the things that appear to be anomalies that exist outside of it as somehow being flaws of reality. It's like something to be treated. And the reality is it's not something new. And so there's a consistent body of research going back to the 70s that is bridging the gaps anthropologically and not necessarily centering Western notions of gender. And so this can better explain the phenomenon of somebody growing up and being socialized as a man, and then one day going, yeah, I've never really felt like this worked for me, but this does. Wearing a dress, wearing makeup, being effeminate, presenting in this way, this feels more like myself. And that's a phenomenon that's consistent across the globe. And so it raises this important notion of, well, yeah, if you're not going to distinguish, excuse me, sex from gender, then this will continue to be an issue. That when somebody says, I am a woman, but they were born male, you're going to go, no, 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 you can't identify as that. You're not allowed to. But the reality is, why can't they? What is the inherent problem with a person being born one way, but presenting, performing, and living their life in the way that they feel is most comfortable to them in terms of gender politics? Like, what's the problem with that?
In my opinion, my humble opinion, and I appreciate you saying all of that, I wanted to address something first before I got into what is the issue with that, right? So, from my understanding, in ancestral times, when there were people who had no concept of, difference between sex, gender, et cetera, or they had their own feeling about whatnot, that they still had different names for what these people were, like some of the names that you rattled off a little bit earlier. And so there were different names that honored this person's journey, like Two Spirit. There's nobody who's saying Two Spirit is X or Y. They're saying Two Spirit is Z, right? So
Mm.
the problem that I see right now is that I feel like we're jumping the gun. We're putting the cart in front of the horse in a system that is already colonized, that has issues already inherent in this system, that we, rather than having these systems quelled, that now we are 2,000 years into this, coming back and saying, well, now we're going to do this because this is the way it was in a different space and time where these issues did not exist. There's a paper by, I believe her name is Sylvia Silko. I forget her last name, but there's a paper that talks about the Hopi tribe and how gender is expressed in the Hopi tribe, and how there's no distinct jobs for men and no distinct jobs for women, that whoever's good at whatever does whatever it is that they're good at. And this is not something that they think about, etc. However, if we're talking about present day America, where we do have the misogyny and we do have the patriarchy and we do have a historic system of oppression towards a particular gender, right? A particular sex. We cannot ignore the historical implications of that. We cannot ignore how the female body has been used and farmed and still continue to be used and farmed to this day. Because in biblical days, 2,000 years ago, when women were trafficked and used and sold into wife slavery, They were not selling people who claimed that they were a woman into this reproductive labor. They weren't selling them into that. They were selling people who were assigned female at birth. And so I'm willing to agree to disagree on this. I don't
Okay,
have
sure.
all of the information on it myself, and
What's the,
that's my
one
take.
one follow-up question, and then I'd like to get to Brandon's comment. Um, what is the problem with the word transgender? Um, what as a third option, right? Is because what we are conventionally calling gender is your body parts match how you socially perform, and transgender is in essence a scientific term to describe the in between sex and gender. What's the problem with using transgender as that alternative language?
Are you asking me that?
Yes.
I don't have a problem with the word transgender.
Okay. Okay. Um,
I have a problem with a person saying that they're a woman and that they should have access, legal access to female spaces, and what that does right now in our misogynistic patriarchal society, where there are people who have, what is it, autogynephilia, who are now getting their rocks off and tainting the space for people who are truly transgender.
sure. Hmm. I I have responses to that, but for the sake of time, we're going to get sucked into this, and I have to wrap up at 6. I would like to continue this conversation. I think it's a very interesting one, and I think it's not something that we should shy away from having this discussion. Um, but I do want to make time for other comments too. So I'm so sorry. I want to
No,
elaborate on them.
it's quite all right.
Okay.
That's why I left my hand down in the
That's okay.
beginning so that other people
Okay.
could speak. And I did want to let you know that if you need a recording from last week's broadcast, I do have one.
Yeah, sure. Please, please feel free to send it to me so I can upload it to YouTube. I really appreciate that. Um, somebody says here, I'm going to get to Brandon's comment because it's a little bit distinct. Chris says there is an ongoing attempt to name every single shade of color to benefit vision challenged people. Sociology as a science. Stephanie says, I think that an aspect of hormonal exposure during gestation that comes in here too. Chris says, I would say differences in gendered social roles is scientific proof. Cultural trends mix things up constantly. Men wore wigs and makeup 200 years ago. That is true too. Also, pink was considered to be the boys' color and blue was considered to be the girls' color, and now it's the opposite. 90% of women would be diagnosed with a condition if it was real. I'm not sure what that corresponds to. Okay. Let's get to Brandon really quickly. He says, I was curious if you were aware of a recent story about Black women being removed from a hospital while in active labor. She was then forced to give birth on the highway minutes later on the way to another hospital. I can't help but consider this medical racism. I'm a new father and couldn't imagine my significant other having to experience this. I would like to hear your thoughts on this story if you have any. Um, I haven't heard of this specific case of a woman giving birth on the highway because she was. I haven't heard of that, but I did see a reel of a person who was in labor while a nurse just kind of sat staring at her computer and was apathetic. I think the explanation is never going to be a thing where we can exactly pinpoint what the core problem is. I think it's going to make up lots of different problems for which, of course, one of the rational explanations here is going to be uh, racism, right? Anti-black racism, medical racism, those kinds of things. But to my knowledge, I can't necessarily speak to that other than um, I really can't speak to a case that I have no information on. I think this sounds atrocious. I think this circumstance should certainly be investigated. But in order for me to have an opinion about it, I would really need to just be exposed to more information. Chris has shared, I was referring to autogynephilia. It was removed from the DSM for a reason. It's mostly a transphobic dog whistle, as far as I'm aware. Um, Okay, sure. Thank you for that. Also, Tanya, I wanted to follow up with you. We had a brief conversation last week about man in the house laws, right? And I told you that I would go and look up some information about man in the house laws. And so what I found was that man in the house laws existed in the 60s as a way to potentially prevent welfare recipients from getting access to their benefits if they weren't demonstrably single parent households. Sometimes these laws are referred to as new men in the house laws. There are some states in which these laws still exist. But man in the house laws of any kind, if you want to use that as a generalizing term, man in the house laws are an actual phenomenon that describe essentially systemically forcing people into a situation in which they are single parent households in order to economically qualify for the welfare benefits that they're looking to receive. So I wanted to add that because I wanted to follow up. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've just been looking for it for years. I've always heard that it existed, and every time I've looked for it, I haven't been able to find it. And so I would love to be able to know when, where, how was it implemented? Because I'm not seeing that. I've not, so they have the Moynihan reports that people said were out there, but the Moynihan reports were talking about deadbeat fathers, who weren't participating at all. So, and then I also heard that rural white women were subjected to the man in the house laws, but that it only lasted for like a month or a few months until they struck it down. But if it is out there and it is something that existed, I would like to know where so that I could confirm or deny this, because I am a content creator as well. And people have been saying this for years, and I just haven't been able to find it. And I really do want to be able to find it. So you say that it existed in the 60s. Where?
Yes, and it still exists in certain states. All you really have to do if you go to Google, you type in man in the house laws, man in the house, not man of the house, man
Okay.
in the house laws. And you'll see an encyclopedia of information about the man in the house rule. Obviously, Google has been doing a thing where it uses AI to like synthesize the broad analysis with citations. So you're welcome to kind of default to the
Okay, I
Google
see it.
summary.
I see it
Um,
now. So I'm
but
gonna
yeah,
take a look into that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah. And then lastly, one philosophical question that I'd like to put out there before we pause and break for the holiday, um, is around this notion of uh, transgender, being uncomfortable with other people identifying one way or the other. Um, what do you make of a circumstance, and this is philosophical, right? What do you make of the circumstance when a person who was raised to be a woman chooses not to identify as that anymore, right? What do you make of that? And then why should it be that society must conform to whatever you personally are discomfortable or uncomfortable with? And I'm gonna leave it there, not because I want to browbeat you and have the last word or anything, but I want to elaborate on this in the not next Sunday, because we're not meeting next Sunday, the following Sunday. I want to be able to have this conversation because it's critical. It's one of the things that is constantly a point of contention on my page, and I know I upset and I ruffle a lot of feathers. Personally, I don't understand why I do that, but I wanna drop that little seed, and if we can continue on that basis 2 weeks from now, I'd like to continue that conversation. Um, Chris has given a reference: autogynephilia, a scientific review, feminist analysis, and alternative embodiment fantasies model is a great recent study on the issue if anyone is interested. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, Tanya. Honestly, I really enjoy the questions. I enjoy the scrutiny that you bring here. I feel like you're adding a very critical lens, even if we can't agree on everything. I think you're the perfect kind of person that I thoroughly enjoy having here, and I hope to see you here. Like I said, friendly reminder, we are not meeting next Sunday. I'm taking next Sunday to be lazy, to spend that with my family. We will be meeting the following Sunday, and we'll dive deep into the topic of reparations. Okay. That's where I'll leave it for now. Thank you so much, Tanya. If you wouldn't mind giving me that video, I'd really appreciate it. And I will see you all in 2 weeks. Okay. I love you all. Take care. Blessings. Be well.